In the summer of 1794, the very men who had dispatched thousands to their graves would at last confront the instrument of terror he himself had wielded with cold, merciless accuracy. Maximilien Robespierre, known across France as the Incorruptible, had come to personify both revolutionary justice and its most extreme excesses. His name alone sent chills through nobles and ordinary citizens alike. Under his direction, the guillotine had become the final judge of French political life. History would savor the bitter irony: the same blade that had taken the heads of kings, queens, and innumerable others was about to claim the men who had championed it most fiercely. This is the tale of how the chief designer of the Reign of Terror became its last and most symbolic casualty, a man whose shattered jaw would keep him from speaking any last words as he climbed the scaffold he had made notorious. Robespierre's execution on July 28, 1794 did not merely end a life, it closed an entire chapter. It stood as the French Revolution consuming its own offspring, a grimly appropriate finale to an era in which justice and revenge had grown impossible to tell apart. To grasp the savage irony of his death, we must first trace the road that carried a provincial lawyer from obscurity to becoming the most feared figure in France. The French Revolution exploded in 1789 amid financial collapse, glaring social inequality, and rampant political corruption. King Louis XVI's monarchy teetered on bankruptcy while the people went hungry. The ancient feudal order was disintegrating, taking centuries of tradition with it. Into this turmoil stepped Maximilien Robespierre, a 30-year-old attorney from Arras who would evolve from a passionate defender of the downtrodden into the living embodiment of revolutionary terror. The revolution passed through ever more radical stages. What started as demands for a constitutional monarchy turned into calls for a republic, and then into the methodical extermination of anyone considered an enemy of the state. By 1793 France was at war with most of Europe, plagued by internal revolts, and paralyzed by suspicion. The revolutionary government, the Committee of Public Safety, proclaimed that terror would now be the order of the day. Robespierre emerged as the dominant voice of this extreme phase. His thinking drew heavily from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, especially the idea of the general will of the people. He was convinced the revolution represented virtue triumphing over corruption, and that anything blocking this moral rebirth had to be destroyed. That inflexible doctrine would soon justify violence on a scale never seen before. The guillotine, originally invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin as a humane, egalitarian means of execution, became the supreme symbol of revolutionary justice. Unlike older methods that varied by social rank, it offered everyone the same swift, supposedly painless death. Under Robespierre's influence, the national razor worked without pause. The 10 months from September 1793 to July 1794 entered history as the Reign of Terror. In that time, revolutionary tribunals sent roughly 17,000 people to the blade. In Paris the machine ran almost daily, while crowds cheered as severed heads dropped into wicker baskets. What had begun as an instrument of justice had turned into a factory of mass killing, with Robespierre as its chief engineer. Paris lived in an atmosphere of permanent dread and mistrust. Neighbors informed on neighbors, children denounced parents, yesterday's comrades became today's mortal foes. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, allowed almost anyone to be arrested on vague charges of hostility to the revolution. Under Robespierre's guidance, the label, enemy of the people, widened to include not only counter-revolutionaries but anyone who failed to display enough revolutionary zeal. Economic misery fed the political horror. Bread stayed scarce and costly despite the revolution's promises. Revolutionary paper money, the assignats, had plunged in value. Factional rivalries grew vicious amid hunger and fear. In that pressure cooker environment, the guillotine doubled as a release valve for public rage. The war against a European coalition, Austria, Prussia, Britain, and others determined to strangle the revolution, deepened the sense of crisis. Every military setback was blamed on traitors inside France, which conveniently justified wider and wider purges. Robespierre and his allies insisted that only terror could save the Republic from enemies abroad and at home. By early 1794 many original revolutionary goals had been achieved, the monarchy abolished, feudalism wiped out, a republic declared. Yet the terror had taken on a life of its own. Convinced the revolution was still in mortal danger, Robespierre kept demanding more arrests, more trials, more executions, against threats real and imaginary. Maximilien Robespierre never personally worked the guillotine, but he was its most persuasive champion and its most methodical organizer. His terror was not mere bloodlust, it was a deliberate political program meant to cleanse France of every obstacle to his vision of perfect revolutionary virtue. Short in stature, barely 5'3", pale skin, and neatly powdered hair made him an improbable master of mass execution. His daily routine revealed the same meticulousness. Each morning he reviewed lists of suspects prepared by informants and local committees, working from simple rooms in the Rue Saint-Honoré surrounded by piles of denunciations and death warrants. His elegant, precise handwriting signed hundreds of execution orders with the calm of someone planning a dinner menu. The Revolutionary Tribunal, restructured under his influence, became a model of lethal efficiency. Trials that once lasted days shrank to minutes. Defendants faced judges whose verdicts were predetermined by political need rather than evidence. Defense lawyers were abolished as hindrances to justice. The only possible outcomes were acquittal, increasingly rare, or death. Robespierre's speeches to the National Convention were rhetorical masterpieces, blending high moral philosophy with ruthless practicality. His reedy voice would rise in passion as he painted vivid pictures of conspirators who had to be destroyed for the people's sake. Every execution, he insisted, was a painful but necessary offering to safeguard the revolution and protect the innocent. The execution process itself had been turned into a grim assembly line. Condemned prisoners rode in open carts from prison to the Place de la Révolution, drums rolling, crowds jeering. The guillotine rose 40 feet, its post painted blood red. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, carried out his task with chilling professionalism, sometimes beheading 50 or 60 people in a single afternoon. Robespierre almost never watched, he stayed in his office, signing more warrants and drafting more speeches. Yet his hand was felt in every detail, the reading of the sentence, the tying of the victim, the drop of the blade, the lifting of the head for the crowd to see. The terror's psychological reach went far beyond the scaffold. Knowing that a single denunciation could mean arrest and death within days froze an entire nation. People policed their words, their facial expressions, even their private thoughts to avoid any hint of incorrect opinion. Saying Robespierre's name too loudly could empty a café in seconds. His surveillance network was vast and sophisticated. The Committee of Public Safety kept dossiers on thousands, local committees filed regular reports, even schoolchildren were urged to report disloyal remarks at home. Universal suspicion became Robespierre's most original contribution to the art of terror. At its peak, the Paris guillotine averaged 30 executions a day, with some days far higher. From arrest to execution took, on average, just 8 days. The human cost is clearest in the stories of individual victims. His former ally Georges Danton, the thunder-voiced tribune who had helped ignite the revolution, was guillotined in April 1794 simply for urging an end to the slaughter. As he was dragged away, Danton reportedly told Sanson, "Don't forget to show my head to the people, it's well worth seeing." Marie Antoinette, now called Widow Capet, went to her death in October 1793 with quiet dignity. When she accidentally trod on the executioner's foot while climbing the steps, she murmured, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it," her last recorded words. Madame Roland, the brilliant salonière who had once supported the revolution, cried from the scaffold, "O liberty! What crimes are committed in thy name?" A phrase that instantly became immortal. 21 Girondin deputies, marched to execution together in October 1793, sang the Marseillaise until the blade silenced them one by one. The last survivor stabbed himself rather than give the guillotine its final triumph. Even children fell victim. 14-year-old Marie-Jeanne Bézu, condemned merely for weeping when her parents were taken, so haunted Sanson that he wrote of her in his diary decades later. Olympe de Gouges, author of the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, was beheaded for daring to criticize Robespierre's growing dictatorship. As she climbed the steps she called out, "Children of the fatherland, you will avenge my death." The Conciergerie prison became a cross-section of a society eating itself, dukes beside dustmen, nuns beside prostitutes, teenagers beside octogenarians, all waiting for the same blade. Foreign visitors recorded the ghostly silence that had fallen over Paris. American Minister Gouverneur Morris noted that people no longer gathered in cafés for fear of being overheard. British agents reported even the most fervent revolutionaries lived in dread of tomorrow's knock on the door. When Robespierre himself was finally toppled and guillotined, his jaw shattered by a pistol shot the night before, unable to deliver a final speech, the relief that swept France was almost physical. Prisoners were freed, tribunals dissolved, the guillotine retired from daily service. Yet the scars ran deep. Commerce had collapsed, skilled workers had fled or died, the currency was trash, Trust between citizens had been poisoned for generations. The very idea of using state terror to enforce ideological purity left a template later copied by Stalin, Pol Pot, and others. Robespierre began as a sincere idealist who hated privilege and loved the poor. He ended as the high priest of a cult that sacrificed thousands to an abstract virtue. His inability to speak at the end, after a career spent sending others to silence, was the revolution's last cruel joke on its most eloquent fanatic. The questions he forces us to face remain uncomfortably alive today. How far is too far in the name of justice? When does the defense of freedom become its opposite? How do we stop well-meaning revolutionaries from turning into tyrants? Robespierre was not a monster born, he was made, step by careful step, by fear, power, and certainty. That is the most frightening lesson of all. The same passions that drove him exist in every human heart, and the distance between liberator and tyrant can be frighteningly small. The blood spilled on the Place de la Revolution more than 200 years ago still speaks. We ignore its warning at our peril.